What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode of the Well Man's Podcast. My name is Brian Brosey. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Dr. Keoni Tita. Keoni, how are you today?
Doing wonderful. I'm excited about this podcast because I can't believe we never even talked about cholesterol and blood lipids as far as statin drugs and
Right.
natural alternatives to it. So I'm I'm glad we're like getting this out there.
Yeah, definitely something that needs to be addressed. You
Right. And
basically
there's
can't read a medication list for a patient without a statin these days, unfortunately.
right. And there's a lot of myths around these drugs too, and so anyway, so hopefully we clear some of this stuff up
Yeah.
as we go through it.
Awesome.
Um, Anyway, so what is cholesterol? Well, it's an organic molecule. It's synthesized in basically all animal cells. It is part of the cell membranes of all animal cells. Cholesterol, comes from Greek, means bile, stereo, solid. So it's like kind of like a type. It's a lipid that's kind of like a waxy type substance,
Mhm.
and it has two primary functions. So we said it's in the membranes, right? So it helps the fluidity of the membranes. So it allows them to maintain their function over wide temperature ranges, and allows things to come in and out of the cellular membranes. Um, and then it's also prevents leakage of ions that are acting, and so it acts as a cellular insulator. And this is very important in like myelin sheaths within the nervous tissue. So
Mhm.
because of that, you would think, well, cholesterol, it's probably huge amounts of it in the brain, and that's actually very, very true. So it's not this bad thing out there.
Right.
It's part, without it we couldn't live. So just want to put that out there.
Absolutely.
Um,
It speaks to like diets that call for no or very, 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 very limited quantities of fat. And this just goes to show how much you would need it or how
yes,
much you do
yes.
need it.
Fat is very, very important. Cholesterol is very important for biological, you know, systems
Yeah.
throughout. And plants even have a type of cholesterol also called plant sterols that also serve similar functions as cholesterol does in animal cells. It's very important in human metabolism. So most people probably know that it serves as a precursor to steroid hormones. And what are steroid hormones? These are like testosterone, estrogen, DHEA. It's also acts as a precursor to mineralocorticoids. These help with electrolyte balance and stuff like that. Aldosterone, progesterone to some extent is a mineralocorticoid also. Deoxycortisone also. These things are made in your adrenal glands and other like your gonads and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But the sex hormones are made gonads. The aldosterone and mineralocorticoids are made more in your adrenal glands. Um, anyway, water balance, electrolyte balance for the mineralocorticoids, and then also the glucocorticoids. Right? We know these are cortisol, deoxycortisol, and they play a big part in protein and carbohydrate metabolism. Also, immunosuppression and inflammatory processes. Hence, that is why with a lot of inflammatory diseases, your doctors will give you derivatives of cortisol, like in
Mhm.
the form of like prednisone or something like that, or cortisone to lower the inflammatory process. It also acts as a precursor to another hormone, vitamin D. And very important, it also provides a framework for bile salts, bile acids. And these things are made in your liver and put in your gallbladder, and they help emulsify dietary fats for absorption.
So it's incredibly important.
Right. It's incredibly important. And so so with that being known, you kind of get an idea of maybe of how having low levels may impact things. Like, so
Mhm.
in theory, right, it can impact your hormone levels if you just, go as low as you can with cholesterol.
Right.
Um, so let's see what else. The thing about cholesterol is, why does it get such a bad rap? And why are doctors constantly trying to lower it with certain types of medications? Well, it's carried through the bloodstream. It's packaged with proteins. These packages are called lipoproteins. So they're proteins and fat put together. There's several types of them. People have heard of them: LDL, HDL. LDL is considered the bad kind of cholesterol particle, and then HDL is considered the good. So LDL, you can think about it as taking fat and cholesterol away from the liver and bringing it to the cells, right?
And
then you can
that's
think
what
of
LDL does.
Yes, and you can think of HDL as taking it from the bloodstream and getting it out of the body and put it into the liver so that your body can get rid of it. Okay, through bile salts, so that you poop them out and just get rid of it.
Okay. Yeah, I know in undergrad we learned happy for HDL being a good thing.
Yeah,
We remembered it was positive.
Right. Anyway, so these lipids like cholesterol and fatty acids, they can't move independently through the bloodstream, so they must be transported as these lipid protein complexes, and hence the name lipoproteins. Okay. Contained within these lipoproteins are proteins called apolipoproteins, and these act as molecular signals to facilitate the movement of lipid-filled lipoproteins, these carriers, to deposit their cargo. So to think about a taxi, right? They deposit their cargo, these fats, into cells and things like that. Unfortunately, the reason why LDL gets a bad rap, it wants to bring these molecules to the cells, fat-containing molecules and cholesterol to the cells, but also it can deposit it within the arteries, right? Which is not a good thing. Also,
that brings to mind kind of what we think about when we think of cholesterol lowering medications, right? And what you constantly see on the commercial is that that plaquing of the artery.
Right. That's right. And you get the clogging of the artery, right? It's deposit, and it can get bigger and bigger. It creates this hole and like inflammatory response, and there's a whole type of mechanism that goes along with that. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a sec, because there's lots of theories of how that happens and why it happens.
But just to clarify, it's that LDL that basically makes that negative commercial true or happen. Is that correct?
Right. It's the LDL. It's the LDL that pretty much does that. So doctors are very interested in making sure that the LDL comes down. Also your total cholesterol. When you get a lipid panel there, and we'll go over this in just a second, you're looking at total cholesterol, you're looking at LDL, you're looking at VLDL, and you're looking at triglycerides and HDL. That's kind of the basic panel that you'd get from your doctor when you go get a regular chemistry panel.
Right.
Anyway, these lipoproteins carry other fat soluble nutrients like CoQ10. CoQ10 we've talked about a little bit is a vitamin. It's used for a number of processes in the body. It acts as an antioxidant. These things also carry vitamin E and carotenoids. And you can think about these compounds as kind of protecting these lipoprotein carriers, as keeping the cholesterol from being oxidized. Okay, so it's acts like an antioxidant. And that's one way that you can help prevent cardiovascular disease with natural compounds. So if you have a lot of these antioxidants with these lipoproteins, you don't get the inflammatory response that you'd get without it. Okay. Right. So let's just go over the four main classes of lipoproteins just to clarify a little bit more. One of them is called chylomicrons, and I just want so people get a picture of how this works. Chylomicrons are basically produced in the small intestine. They basically deliver dietary fats to the cell, to the muscles for energy and fat for cells, but they have to go through, they deliver cholesterol to the liver for packaging to be dispensed out throughout the body, all right? And then you have very low density lipoproteins. These take triglycerides, phospholipids, cholesterol, like these fatty molecules from the liver and transfer them to the fat cells, okay? So just like what LDL does. And LDL is kind of, you can think about as a secondary stage of VLDL. So VLDL is transport, and as things get dropped off, then you get it turned into an LDL type thing. Think about a taxi dropping off passengers, so to speak.
Okay.
And then it becomes an LDL, and LDL is, again, transports things to the cells in the body, but unfortunately LDL can transport things to the lining in the arteries, and that's where it may not be needed. And then the HDL lipoproteins, these take excess cholesterol from your cells, from the bloodstream, and bring them back to liver for prepackaging so that the body can get rid of it.
Okay.
All right. There's another storage form of fatty molecule called triglycerides, and these also play a critical role in metabolism and energy utilization. And they are like a very concentrated energy source for the body. Unfortunately, the body will use glucose over triglycerides for fuel first. So when you see the standard American diet that's very high in carbohydrate and fats, what do you see? You see a bunch of triglycerides floating around in the bloodstream, and they shouldn't be there. This is one of the reasons why I am a big proponent of intermittent fasting, because you can deplete the glucose in the bloodstream, and now your body will want to use the triglycerides for energy.
Okay.
So, and just so people know, we talked about this on our fasting podcast. To deplete your glucose throughout your body usually takes about, and in the glycogen stores, even in the liver, it takes about 12 to 24 hours to do that. And if you fast,
so it's a prolonged fast you need for this. It's not an 8
right.
hour
If you
one.
Right. But if you eat fasting, which I just call putting more space between your meals, if you do that, you're helping your body to burn some of these triglycerides so they don't get stored as fat.
Mm-hmm. It's a very nice way of putting it too.
Yeah.
It's definitely a lot more convincing. Just,
right.
More space between your meals.
Right. Right. And I just want to go over, so I'll try to go over this slowly for people just so they get an idea, because I know we're throwing a lot of terminology out there, but we'll get to the good stuff in a minute, to where, okay, well, how do you fix the problem?
Okay.
But anyway, there's an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Okay. So based on that name, lipoprotein lipase, that enzyme has something to do with these lipoprotein molecules that are transporting cholesterol in and out through the body, right?
Okay.
But what it does is, when it's activated, it removes triglycerides, right? Triglycerides are packaged with these lipoprotein lipases, these molecules, not the lipase, but they're packaged with the lipoprotein. And so the lipoprotein lipase just basically gets the triglycerides away from the VLDL molecule, which then produces an intermediate lipoprotein first, and then it converts to LDL. Each VLDL particle contains one molecule of a compound called ApoB, which is retained as VLDL loses triglycerides and shrinks to become more of a cholesterol-rich LDL. All right, and the reason why I bring that up is because ApoB may be something that doctors test for to see if you're at risk for cardiovascular stuff. All right. So that's a name that people may have heard of. And one of the tests that would look at that, and we'll talk about it in just a second, is called NMR. It's an NMR, so it stands for nuclear magnetic resonance lipoprofile. That's like a secondary test to really see how much you are at risk.
Okay, so what's the difference between your typical test and then this one where you're gonna do the NMR?
It's more in depth.
NMR.
And I'm gonna talk about it in a minute. It's more in depth.
Okay.
And I do recommend people to look at their particle sizes, especially if they are like slightly elevated in cholesterol, and doctors are, and these other particles, if they're slightly elevated or on the, and in comparison with the HDL, look like they should be on statin drugs. Well, that can, if we look further, we may see that they're not at such high risk, okay, for a cardiovascular event. So that's why I like doing this secondary test, the NMR lipoprofile.
And where that would become valuable for you, Keoni, is if you would recommend that person goes the next step in taking a medication, or is there more power to that knowledge than I realize?
There may be more power to that knowledge, right? So let's say that they have these high levels of lipids floating around in their blood, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And what we can look at and see how they're packaged in these lipoproteins, and we can look at their particle sizes. The particle sizes, if they're very dense, are more atherosclerotic producing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm following.
If they're very fluffy and not as dense, you're not going to be at as much as risk for cardiovascular events. So you can tell that from the NMR lipo profile. And there are some other things on that profile, like this ApoB, that would tell people, if they're at more at risk or not.
Okay.
So, it's just, I just want to bring that up to people, because some people can ask their doc to run those things, especially if they just, have this thing where they don't want to be on statin medications. And I think it's, you really have to kind of do your homework with that, and just not take it for your doctor's word. Okay, every time it's a little bit above 200, and that's kind of where doctors start thinking about statin drugs. With above 200 with total cholesterol, they want to give a statin drug. You don't necessarily need to do that, and sometimes it's very easily treatable with just lifestyle alone. And by the way, that is the first kind of treatment you want to do. Is you want to focus on lifestyle to help optimize your blood lipids.
You don't say.
Yep, that's the first thing. And unfortunately, it's just, a lot of docs don't jump to that, or they're just like, well, let's just put you on statin and don't even talk about that. And one of the things, just like I said before, is the intermittent fasting can really help with that.
Yeah. Just put more space between your meals, man.
Yeah. Put more space. Absolutely. Put more space between your meals if you can, or do some of these other things we're going to talk about in a minute here. So we talked about current lab. It's current labs, the normal labs, total cholesterol, that level should be less than 100, less than 200. That's what docs are looking for. Really, they want them, a lot of doctors want them as low as you can go, which I kind of implied at the beginning that may not necessarily be a good thing. Right. When they're looking at LDL, they want it less than 130. Okay. HDL, basically, the higher the better for the most part. Okay. I like to see triglycerides less than 100. And you can usually bring those down pretty easily by eating a low carbohydrate diet.
Now, do all these lipoprotein, these different compounds, do they all have, do they have an inverse relationship? Do they have a relationship together? If your HDL is higher, I assume your LDL is lower. But then what does that do to your total cholesterol, like you mentioned?
Well, it's really interesting you ask that, because to calculate cardiovascular risk, yes, you can look at, like the ratios of HDL to LDL, or ratios of total cholesterol to HDL. And you can look at the ratios to get maybe a little bit clearer picture on what your risk is. But, these are all fatty lipid molecules, right? So as cholesterol goes up, so goes all of them to some extent. Right. So if you're eating a high fat diet, especially a diet higher in animal fat, you will see these things go up. And if you combine that with, the standard American diet, which puts fat and carbs together, you'll see significant increases in there, especially your triglycerides. And one of the first things that will come down on a low carbohydrate diet are triglycerides. And that's a great indication, because then everything else will tend to follow it down.
Okay.
All right. So other things that are more indicative, or at least has research that show they're more indicative of a cardiovascular event. And that's really what we're looking at, right? When we look at cholesterol levels, we're just trying to see, all right, what is your risk of cardiovascular disease or a cardiovascular event?
Right.
All right. And there is research that shows that, lowering your cholesterol can help prevent cardiovascular disease and a cardiovascular event. That's, that's not a myth out there. And I hear people say, well, we shouldn't even be worrying about it. That's not true. I do think we do go overboard, at least on the conventional side, with giving everybody statin drugs or cholesterol lowering meds all the time. But there's some truth to the so-called madness there. So I just don't want people going away from this podcast saying, well, statin drugs are bad. That's not the thing. I mean, you with any medication, as we stated before, you weigh the advantages and disadvantages of them, and if and when you can, you come off of them, or at least reduce the doses of them. But I also like to look at within that MMR lipid profile, the secondary test to the main chemistry panel, lipid chemistry panel, is I look at high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We talked about it on a number of podcasts. That's an inflammatory marker. Inflammation is huge, right? I mean, if cholesterol is oxidized, it's much more damaging to your artery lining, right? So, and anytime there's inflammation going on, there's a big problem there. You want to lower the inflammation. Homocysteine is another compound that, just think about it as an inflammatory marker that you can test. Another one is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is needed to form clots. So if you can lower your fibrinogen level, guess what? You're going to be less likely to form clots that can lead to a cardiovascular event. Other things to look at, and this is why I run these tests or recommend them all across to my patients, is I look at insulin levels, and I also look at hemoglobin A1C. And hemoglobin A1C is a measure of how fast you are glycating, right? And you can have glycation reactions not only with protein molecules in your body, but also with fatty molecules like cholesterol and other lipids, and they will bind sugar molecules to it, which then creates more of an inflammatory response, which can create more stress on the arterial walls. So I even like looking at that. And this is why diabetics are at significant risk for cardiovascular events, especially if their insulin levels are high and hemoglobin A1C is high. So I'll look at all of those. And guess what is one of the best ways to lower, your hemoglobin A1C and insulin? Well, and besides diet and all exercise, I mean, we know all that, but again, put more space between your meals than you normally would, So, and that's an easy thing to do. And I ease a lot of my patients into that. And we talked about that on our fasting episodes. I think it's episodes 33 and 60. If people want to go back and look at the fasting episodes there. We know that statin drugs do play a role in, reducing major cardiovascular events as far as primary prevention, meaning that giving them the people that seem to be at risk but are not actually having cardiovascular disease, it may help. This is why a lot of doctors put people on it, when they may not necessarily, they may put them on and say, well, your cholesterol levels aren't that high, but we do know, you had family members who had cardiovascular events, so on and so on. Maybe we should put you on a statin drug or a cholesterol lowering medication. And they also help secondary prevention. And, secondary prevention is, when you detect the disease early and you give the statin drugs, and it can keep it from getting worse. There's some controversy with secondary prevention, especially as in regards to women taking statin drugs, but for the most part, the research seems to indicate it helps with both primary and secondary prevention.
Okay.
Some other things that people may not know about cholesterol levels, they are influenced by a number of things. One of the things they're influenced by is just season. Cholesterol levels tend to be the highest in winter. So when you go into your doctor, and you have borderline cholesterol levels, just let your doctor know. Maybe it's a little bit higher than normal because you got it taken in the winter. Stress levels play a big role. Menstrual cycles play a big role in it. Tends to be higher during pregnancy and lactation. Having a current infection may slightly lower levels of HDL and LDL. Post myocardial infarction, a cardiovascular event may be lowered a little bit while, after that, 5 to 6 weeks after. There's many things that can vary the levels there. I mean,
That's
shoot,
interesting. It seems like you should get your physical and these sorts of lab values done on a very consistent yearly, annually schedule. So it happens the same day, or you know what I mean?
So you can see the trends. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you can see the
exactly.
snapshots. I mean, I even heard things that, you know, the values are influenced whether you're lying or seated, you know?
Wow.
And so that's kind of crazy. So it is like you said and implied there, like that's why I do recommend them all my patients, like go get your blood work every year, go get it done annually. I mean, insurance covers that for the most part, covers your lipid panel and just a regular chem panel. At the very least, I would do that. You're definitely gonna help find something very early on and prevent something, you know, disasters from happening.
Yeah.
So what's the conventional approach to all this? Well, we've talked about a lot of it. We talked about dietary modification. That's a big one, right? And typically the advice is, you know, just stop eating animal fat for the most part. I would just want to add to that, lower your caloric load, maybe consider fasting there. We do know that getting proper sleep helps with this. We also know that getting exercise helps with that. So I don't really want to go into that, but let me just talk a little bit about the drugs because I see this over and over again. Probably first line defense of keeping cholesterol levels down are statin drugs. And these are what are called HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. And basically, I know it's a big name, but HMG-CoA reductase is an enzyme that helps the body produce more cholesterol. So we want to give a compound like statin drugs that inhibit that. Therefore, we lower cholesterol. The problem with that is when we are lowering cholesterol, there are other things down the line that HMG-CoA reductase also helps produce. And one of them is CoQ10. And CoQ10 is a great antioxidant to have around there, keeps your mitochondria running, is a very heart healthy thing to do, and may lower blood pressure.
Mm.
So I always, whenever somebody's on a statin, whether it's natural or not, then there are natural statins, which we'll talk about, but whether it's natural or not, I always recommend at least 100 milligrams of CoQ10 daily. It's a great thing to take. It does so many things in your body.
And you take that alongside your statin. Well, separate it out. I know, like you have that
I usually like
rule of thumb.
It's a general rule of thumb, but yeah, you could take it with your statin. That's not a problem. But yes, I like to separate all the natural supplements away from the pharmaceutical meds.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you take statin and it's not really making a big difference, or you just have really nasty side effects from it. And like you get the muscle aches and pains, which CoQ10, there's some research that shows that taking CoQ10 with it can maybe help inhibit that. But let's say you just get bad side effects from it and you can't do that, or it's not doing its job. Then you can do things that you can take meds that kind of target cholesterol absorption. So dietary cholesterol doesn't get absorbed and add to the total number of things.
Okay.
These are things like Zetia, bile acids, sequestrants like cholestyramine, other drugs called fibrates. These things help lower cholesterol. Fibrates basically stimulate cellular fatty acid uptake, and let's see, it basically what it does is just helps it get out of the bloodstream faster, and then in the process it also helps get HDL up to help it get taken back to liver, repackaged, and gotten rid of. I want to bring these two medications up because they're fairly new kids on the block with lowering statin drugs. One is called a PCSK9 inhibitor. I have no idea what that stands for, but you can look it up. PCSK9 inhibitor. It's basically an enzyme called PCSK9, and when you inhibit this, you basically are inhibiting the LDL production pathway. So you inhibit LDL from being produced. And then also it means that if you do that, it also will keep LDL receptors on the cells able to grab LDL and get it out of the bloodstream better. So it's highly effective in reducing LDL, but the cost of it is limiting its use. So hopefully it'll be more affordable with time. It's fairly new on the block. And another one that's fairly new is called bempedoic acid. I think this one was just by the Food and Drug Administration approved back in February 2020. And it's an oral non-statin medication. And so instead of inhibiting HMG CoA reductase, it inhibits another compound called adenosine triphosphate citrate lyase, or ACL. It's an ACL inhibitor, and it lowers LDL cholesterol and inhibits cholesterol synthesis. So that's another drug I just want to put out there for people just to think about. So it's not all about statins. There are other ways to do it, but typically statins tend to be the first line of defense there. So what's actually going on when we actually are getting atherosclerosis? Well, there's many different theories behind that. I kind of subscribe to the kind of chronic inflammation theory of atherosclerosis, where either due to high blood pressure or smoking or high sugar levels, high glycation going on, you get injury to the intima or the endothelial cells of the arteries. And then the body has to kind of deal with that, right? And if you have injury there, it's almost like you have to try to heal it. And it's like let's throw plaquing on it, cholesterol plaques on there. And over time, you get this ballooning out and the clogging of arteries. There's many theories to it, but when you look inside it, the same thing is happening. You're basically getting a clogging of the arteries based on some form of ballooning out at the endothelial lining or the intima. The intima is like a little bit deeper than that lining. There are things, and we know there are things that increase LDL and like animal fats, simple carbs. We talked about elevated HSCRP. These are all inflammatory markers, environmental toxins, smoking, environmental chemicals out there. In episode 41, we talked about hemochromatosis. That can lead to significant atherosclerosis. One of my big minerals we talk about all the time is magnesium. Magnesium deficiency may lead to that. Lack of excretion of bile, not having your liver functioning properly can do it. And then overall, like just having a genetic propensity towards, just having high blood lipids.
Right.
Couple things that I've heard out there that I just want to clear up. People say, I've heard this before, that statins cause cancer. We don't know. Let's just put it that way. We do know that cholesterol does in itself kind of act as an antioxidant throughout the body, but certainly not as powerful as some of the other ones we've dealt with. But we don't know if it promotes or prevents cancer. But it does seem like some cancers, especially with the elderly, like long-term statins, like breast cancer, prostate cancer, there may be a higher risk associated with it. But to say that it causes cancer is a myth.
Yeah.
Okay. And we still need to, we need to know. And then also on the other side of the coin, we know that statin drugs may actually help prevent certain types of cancers. So there's that. And how about, you've heard this, right? Do statins cause dementia? Have you heard that? Anyway, that's a myth that's out there. There's just not good research that supports that. And in fact, it seems the other way around. It seems like it may help prevent dementia.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense based off what they're doing.
What doesn't make sense based on what statins do, taking the lipids out of, lowering the cholesterol so you don't get plaquing, right? So you don't get these small blockages and things like that. So we talked about what not to eat as far as just in general. I want to just stress this. We do know a high-fat diet will raise these things, okay? Especially when combined with carbs. And I think that's the key, okay? Because there's some research out there that a ketogenic diet does not necessarily do that. I just don't think ketogenic diet, unless you're extremely strict or have to really be strict about it, is sustainable in the long term. And I think there can lead to rebound carbohydrate binging with it also. But anyway, I do think the ketogenic diet's a much better way to lower blood glucose and all that, and it's great for weight loss. But I'm not so sure about what it's doing to your blood lipids and stuff like that over the long term.
Right.
Still, I'm a big proponent of it. But eventually, we want to get people to be able to eat a well-rounded, balanced diet. And what is the diet that has the most research on it as far as helping with cardiovascular disease and
Does it
stuff?
start with an M?
It starts with an M. Yes, it's a Mediterranean diet. And it's not the American Mediterranean diet where it's pasta and bread all day. You know, it's like lots of fruits, vegetables, and things like that. So those are the things to eat. So we've heard that over and over again. One thing people may not have heard of, and I'm just going to bring this up because I don't want people like getting pissed off at me and you, Brian, that where we said don't drink coffee. But I just want to bring this up because it is out there. There's research that shows that drinking unfiltered coffee, the way I like to drink it, which is in a French press, may increase cholesterol levels. Okay. And there's a mechanism behind that. Drinking filtered coffee, not so much. Now, there's a caveat to that, right? Coffee tends to be one of the biggest, most consumed antioxidants that Americans consume, right?
Okay.
And it has a lot of good chemicals in there. It's the main antioxidant that Americans consume. So there's that part of it too.
Yeah, we did that whole episode with Jade.
So if somebody has very high cholesterol levels and is trying to lower them, or you just want to go in and see your doctor beforehand and you don't want to add any insult to injury, stop your coffee intake for a while and it may help bring levels down a little bit.
But specifically that unfiltered coffee.
Unfiltered coffee. And this is true whether it's caffeinated or decaffeinated. Unfiltered coffee may increase cholesterol levels. There's some research that supports that.
Yeah, you're probably getting some of those plant lipids, I would imagine.
What's that?
I would imagine you're getting some sort of plant lipid from the coffee, especially when it's unfiltered, French pressed.
Well, you're getting a certain type of compound that helps generate more cholesterol. You are getting plant sterols, but the plant sterols tend to be beneficial. Okay. And you're getting so plant and I'll talk about that in a second here. So let's just talk about natural treatments. And since you brought it up, let's just talk briefly about plant sterols. So plant sterols, just think about them as the plant world counterpart of cholesterol, right? And they function like cholesterol does in animals. And they're part of the plant cell membranes and they do similar things. What they do is they are themselves poorly absorbed from the diet, and you can think about them as kind of blocking cholesterol from animal foods from being absorbed. All right, so you can think about them as like coating like the intestinal wall, so to speak, so that cholesterol does not get absorbed into the body. So it reduces your dietary intake of cholesterol.
Okay.
So they're poorly absorbed. Like I said, chemical similarity to cholesterol. They compete with cholesterol for absorption in the intestines. So you can think about it that way. An analysis of 57 trials over almost 4,000 individuals report an average LDL cholesterol reduction of 9.9% with 2.4 grams of these plant sterols a day. So that's part of my treatment. I will give plant sterols just to help inhibit absorption with people. And this is not, woo-woo science. I mean, even the FDA is kind of on board with this one. So that's a big one. That's one that I use quite a bit, but let's just go through some of the other ones that are out there just so people know. And there's quite a bit that have some pretty good science on that. Artichoke, you can get them in tabs, 1,200 milligrams a day. Several randomized controlled trials support artichoke extract. It lowers total and LDL cholesterol. and it can raise HDL cholesterol. Another, I don't use that so much, but certainly not opposed to that. Certainly not going to hurt people to use that. Another one I will use periodically is pantethine. Pantethine is a derivative of pantothenic acid or vitamin B5. Okay. And so I've heard some people go, well, I'll just take my vitamin B5 and help lower my cholesterol. Nope, can't do that because it doesn't work, at least not according to studies. But 300 milligrams of pantethine taken 3 times a day will help lower triglyceride levels. Studies have shown that it has lowered total cholesterol and LDL by up to 13.5%. And you get a consequent elevation in HDL cholesterol. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Another one, have you heard of amla or Indian gooseberry? It's very high in vitamin C. It's a great antioxidant. It's an Ayurvedic medicine.
Of the Indian gooseberry.
It's used a lot in Ayurvedic medicine. People like me know about it quite a bit. Studies showed that healthy diabetic volunteers given 2 to 3 grams of this for 3 weeks experienced significant decreases in total cholesterol and triglycerides. This is interesting. A head-to-head comparison between amla and civastatin or Zocor in 60 hyperlipidemic individuals demonstrated similar effects in lipid profile. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Right. We all know garlic. Garlic has benefits, and these benefits have been shown in numerous studies to give people favorable blood lipid profiles. A comprehensive review of 39 primary trials concluded that prolonged use of garlic, you should eat garlic in everything. It goes great with so many things. But greater than 2 months of using garlic daily lowered cholesterol and LDL.
Wow.
So that's cool.
Yeah.
And the other thing about garlic, there's also some research shows that it will lower blood pressure. And this goes back to the mechanism of action of how cholesterol plaque may happen with endothelial injury, right? We know that high blood pressure causes chronic stress to the arterial walls. And if it stays significantly high, you're just chewing up your arterial walls, which can create more plaquing. You put more stress on it. There's some other herbs out there that are used in like Chinese medicine that also play a role. There's one in particular, one called Gynostemma pentaphyllum. There's a study, a 12-week placebo-controlled trial of this herb in healthy obese men and women. And what we saw was that abdominal fat, body weight, overall fat, and percent body fat, all of these things were reduced, as well as there were some studies that showed total cholesterol reduction also as compared to controls. I do use combinations of herbs, Chinese herbs, that will help lower cholesterol, and they work by many different mechanisms that aren't just HMG CoA reductase. This one basically stimulates what we call AMPK activation, and basically this is like a metabolic master switch in the body. And if you stimulate that, you're basically helping the body work more efficiently, and it positively affects cholesterol levels throughout the body. And they've seen this over and over again in animal studies. Another one I want to talk about that people don't really think about is flavonoids, specifically hesperidin, 500 milligrams a day. These things are found in citrus fruits, particularly their peels. All right. And hesperidin seems pretty cool in what it does. It also may activate AMPK, which is this metabolic master switch. And when it does, when you take that in and take it in through diet or in supplemental form, and these studies are all done on supplements, it can really, really help optimize blood lipids and even sugar levels. This is very interesting. The leading diabetes medication is called metformin, which also works through this mechanism of turning on AMPK pathways. In a 6-week randomized controlled trial on 24 diabetic participants, supplementation with 500 milligrams of hesperidin daily improved glycemic control increase total antioxidant capacity. So what are we doing there? We can prevent injury. We're bringing down the oxidative stress. Therefore, these blood lipids don't get oxidized, and it significantly help reduce the risk of diabetes. That's hesperidin alone.
Yeah.
So that's a neat one. Hesperidin also reduces the high sensitivity CRP. That's that blood marker, inflammatory marker, which I think is a better marker for future cardiovascular events when compared to the regular chemistry panel. And it also, we talked about ApoB marker, and it also helped reduce that. So hesperidin is an easy, cheap thing to take. So this is something I will use also to help people lower blood lipids if they're open to supplementation and definitely don't want to be on statin drugs. It can help significantly.
Mm-hmm.
We did a fiber podcast. We talked about this a little bit, specifically soluble fibers. These are the non-digestible, fermentable carbohydrates. You know, it has a lot. They help our gut flora do their thing. If we keep our gut flora healthy, I'm not going to go into it too much because probiotics and prebiotics certainly help, but keeping our gut flora healthy also will help optimize blood lipid levels. But soluble fiber, you know, especially when included as part of a low animal fat diet or saturated fat diet, it basically reduced LDL cholesterol and also basically keeps it from getting absorbed into the body. So it will bind bile, you know, help these lipids bind bile salts and help your body get rid of them through the intestines.
Mm.
CoQ10, this is a big one. You know, if you're on a statin drug, you should take it. And it's one of those things that if you don't have sufficient levels of CoQ10, you speed up the process of cardiovascular disease. So it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And it lowers blood pressure, which I think is good, and will lower HSCRP. Carotenoids, remember we did that? We talked about lycopene, we did a tomato podcast. That one.
Episode 58.
Yep, that one.
Mighty tomato.
That's right. And that one always gets me hungry. But the big carotenoid here that really helps is lycopene, which is in tomatoes. And it helps prevent damage from oxidation. And so these oxidized particles can't be problematic. What is it? I think an analysis of 12 trials I'm reading here of lycopene revealed an average reduction in LDL cholesterol. That's really cool. And it seems to, this is interesting about lycopene, and I didn't know this, but it seems to also act as a statin by inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase. So that's cool, right? Yeah. And maybe that's one of the ways that it works. Vitamin E, this is why I always recommend multivitamins that have vitamin E or a complete complex of vitamin E. Vitamin E, again, is a powerful antioxidant, inhibits the oxidation of LDL particles. That's one way it works. But you want a complete complex. Specifically, you want gamma tocopherol, and it basically helps keep any reactive nitrogen compounds that act as free radicals from being destructive. And so you definitely want to make sure that you're taking, this is why I always recommend a multivitamin that has a complete complex of vitamin E instead of just D-alpha tocopherol. So that's really and I always say this, that's my first line of defense. I think, you know, in rare exceptions, most people should be on a good multivitamin and take it, you know, most days.
Yeah.
Tea polyphenols. So drinking your tea, green tea catechins, significant cholesterol lowering effect. Lots of studies have shown that. It's whether you're drinking green tea or black tea, both seem to help with that. And it's a powerful antioxidant. Pomegranate is another one. We haven't talked about pomegranate specifically in our podcast, but there are so many beneficial compounds in pomegranate. The polyphenols there suppress LDL oxidation like you wouldn't believe. It basically protects the arterial wall from being inflamed and degraded.
In a trial of over 48 overweight or obese participants, 1,000 milligrams of pomegranate extract improved total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and HDL cholesterol levels, and then also helped optimize many other markers. I want to bring up curcumin, even though it doesn't have a ton of research on it, lowering blood lipids. It does seem to have some cholesterol lowering effects with some research, but it is also, it can help thin the blood. It may help keep plasma fibrinogen levels down. It may also, and it seems to also lower high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker that we were talking about. And then we can't finish this podcast without talking about fish oil, right? So we know that omega-3 fatty acids are beneficial cardiovascularly, okay? And they basically accomplish this by promoting the excretion of cholesterol via the liver and the gallbladder. They also accomplish this by giving you a healthy ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. And the standard American diet is very high in the omega-6 bad essential fatty acids. And once you get a balanced ratio, and of 3 to 6, you get a reduction in cardiovascular disease. There's numerous studies that have shown that taking fish oil can lower morbidity and mortality, reduce cardiovascular events, and even studies show that people who've had various cardiovascular procedures, like stenting procedures, that have already had disease progression, they prevent you from having other issues or other surgeries. So that's really cool. And red yeast rice, you heard of that. That's the natural statin that I was talking about at the beginning. And usually you do anywhere from 800 to 1600 milligrams. You usually do it at night because cholesterol levels seem to rise in the evening more than anything. And this is a natural HMG CoAce reductase inhibitor. Lots of reviews on that. I still give CoQ10 with this, even though with this type of statin drug, this natural statin, you just don't seem to get the side effects that you would with the other ones. But the potential is still there. These red yeast rice extracts are very well tolerated and effective in lowering LDL, total cholesterol, and they may be extremely safe in younger individuals. So a lot of doctors are kind of apprehensive about giving statin drugs to very young people. This one you don't have to be so much worried about.
Okay.
Another one you've heard about, niacin. Niacin helping lower. The problem with niacin is it can give you a flushing reaction. And some of the other forms of niacin, like inositol hexanicotinate, they don't give you the flushing reaction, but also don't seem to have the benefit of lowering your blood lipids like niacin does. There is some type of, sometimes you get used to that flushing reaction where it's just transient. And if you take niacin over time, it can go away. But people haven't taken niacin and aren't used to it, and you give it to them. I mean, some people turn beet red and their ears feel like they're burning and they feel like they're having a toxic reaction, but they're not. But niacin should just be part of a good multivitamin. That's the way I use it. I don't use it as much for lowering cholesterol, even though, the FDA is well aware of the blood lipid lowering effects of niacin. So it certainly can help. Another thing, natural product that I want to bring up that a lot of people don't know about is bergamot. I mean, maybe people know about bergamot as far as like an essential oil. It's basically, bergamot is a fruit, and it's basically people consider it to be a hybrid of like orange and lemon, or it's just a weird kind of fruit. It has a wonderful, wonderful smell to it, but it contains like lots of flavonoid glycosides, which these also have statin-like effects. And then any citrus also contains a compound called naringin, which also has been shown and these are found in the peels of like lemon and orange and things like that, in grapefruit, that also have shown to inhibit the oxidation of LDL and also help with the excretion of cholesterol through the intestines out of the body. It's a really interesting thing. I haven't used it. I may start using it. It's kind of has getting more and more research on it right now. And it just seems to be a really safe thing, neat thing that people certainly can try. A trial that enrolled 98 people with elevated blood lipids found that 12 weeks of supplementation with this bergamot led to reduced triglycerides and greater weight loss compared to placebo. So it may be a good addition in conjunction with statin drugs. It may help lower your dose of statin drugs too. So a lot of these things in combination with the statin drugs can keep your dose low, which is a good thing, which is going to reduce the likelihood of side effects.
Right.
So I know that was a lot. I want to try to fit it all in one podcast. I hope it helps, but if people have questions, just get back to Brian and I, and we can go from there. But in general, just to sum, the myths about cholesterol, statin drugs are efficacious. I think they are being used too widely in lieu of where natural medicines can definitely help and sometimes be used alone. I think they're used too much without talking about nice natural alternatives and lifestyle changes. And so I have that, my therapeutic orders always start with lifestyle change, do the natural products, and then if and when needed, look at some of these other medications, prescription meds that can help. Yep. And one last thing before I go, because I know people will bring this up. Do eggs cause an increase in cholesterol? Are they problematic? The research does not say eggs cause any issue, but just remember, eggs are packed full of fats and triglycerides and things like that. So you are gonna, you may see a transient increase from eggs, but long term, let's just put it this way: the whole goal is we're trying to reduce cardiovascular events, and eating tons of eggs, there's no research that shows that it increases your risk of a cardiovascular event. And I've talked to years back, a friend of mine who's a cardiologist said, there are people that I have seen that their blood lipids look great, everything's good, and the next week or next month I get a call and they had a heart attack. So it's also true that you can also get heart attacks and have perfect blood lipids. So there's other things going on.
Yeah.
So, but as far as statin drugs being able to work and cholesterol having some type of atherogenic effect, absolutely, it can, or blood lipids having that. I just think there's better ways to go with treatment than just throwing statins at people all day, every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Keoni, as far as the optimal levels, HDL, LDL, total cholesterol, do you have an optimal level range?
So that's a great question. Most conventional docs will, they may even just look at your total cholesterol, and if it's above 200, they may recommend statin drugs based on history and things like that. Of course, most of them are also looking at seeing what the HDL level is. But let's say your cholesterol level is above 200, and those other markers on a primary panel, HDL, LDL, all those are not good either. Your triglycerides are up. They will generally recommend a statin at that stage. I certainly won't. I will recommend lifestyle change first to see if that can help. If the levels are up around 250 and they have a relatively healthy diet and things like that, that's when I may start recommending some of these prescription meds. Now, again, that's in relation to the HDL and stuff like that. And that's when I would consider running one of those NMR lipid profiles and see. I may run the HSCRP, the hemoglobin A1C, and really see what their risk is. There's something out there called a Boston heart study lab where I'll run those, where it will do everything that's related, all these markers that are related to cardiovascular disease and predicting future cardiovascular events. I may run that then, and if that comes back indicative of looking like you may have issues, that and along with high blood pressure, right? If they have that, then I'm going to recommend it. But the goal will always be to come off of it. And I'll always recommend them in conjunction with other things. And there are people who may have these awful numbers and just can't tolerate statins. Well, there are other ways to approach that problem, which we talked about, the other prescription meds, and maybe they can't tolerate those. Then it's like we go hardcore with some of these natural meds that they can tolerate. So you have to really look at the person as an individual here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
family history plays a big role in this. You know, there are some people out there that can eat perfectly and just have high blood lipids. It's just genetic there.
Yeah, absolutely.
What on the other, so then they may be a case where we have to do more invasive intervention. On the other hand, there are, we also don't want to slam cholesterol levels down into and blood lipids down into numbers that are so low. And I've heard doctors say, just get your cholesterol levels as low as possible, and the lower the better. And that may not be true either. There's kind of like a balance there that we want. There are studies that show that like modern day hunter-gatherer tribes, they tend not to even have cholesterol levels close to 200 at all. Okay. And they're around 150, 160. But then you got this whole French paradox thing going on where, they tend to have higher fat diets, the French, and tend to have on average higher cholesterol levels than the Americans. But guess what? Have less cardiovascular events and less cardiovascular disease. Is it the wine? I mean, like, what's going on there? I mean, it may be the lifestyle, right? It may be they walk. It may be they're less stressed. That all that stuff plays a role in this. So, just looking at cholesterol is just, we need to look at much more. It's not enough. But it's also, I don't want people going away thinking, well, Dr. Keoni's a naturopath and, therefore he hates statin drugs. There's a time and place for them.
Right.
There's many ways to attack this though. I mean, usually when you have high cholesterol levels, you also have other issues going on. Usually you have high sugar levels too. So that's a role. The other thing I want to bring up, which I didn't mention, is thyroid levels. If your thyroid levels are even within normal range but are slightly increasing, guess what corresponds to an increase in TSH levels or slowing down of the thyroid is cholesterol. So sometimes you can treat cholesterol levels by just getting the thyroid optimized. Also with men going through andropause, testosterone levels play a role there too. So a lot of times guys on, if you give them testosterone, their blood lipids will help optimize also if they need it. So there's many ways to kind of attack this, and you just have to look at each person as an individual. But it's like what you said at the beginning of the podcast. It seems like everybody that comes through my office or your office is on a statin drug. And it just makes me, are they really looking at all the other options?
Right.
And I'm sure I see it, but I know you'll start seeing it, is some of these injuries, musculoskeletal injuries that people complain about may be due to high dose statin drugs. So anyway, I know, thanks for sticking it out with us guys, but I know we went way over, but it's a good one to go over on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully you stuck it out with us, but you can always come back to it.
Yeah. And we'll talk with you next week. And until then, be well.
Yep. Take care, guys.